Howdy everyone, how's it going? I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be covering a subject that all of you have heard of before, as I'm sure, and that's regarding RAW versus JPEG. These are two formats that are very commonly used in the photography industry, and today we're going to be going over them, why you might prefer one over the other, and is one of them better than the other? Well, you'll find out. Let's take a look. So I'd like to start things off with talking about the RAW format. And RAW files are huge amounts of files that when you hit the shutter release on your camera, it's stored on the data chip of your camera and it's not edited in any way whatsoever. So it's then needed to have some sort of photo editor where you can play around, edit, and then export it as a JPEG, for example, to be able to view it on various devices and applications. So the fact that RAW files contain so much data within them about the different lights and shadows within a photograph allow us room to play around and manipulate with them when we're playing around in a photo editor. And this is great when we, for example, overexpose a shot or do something else to mess the photo up. The only downside to this is that the fact that they contain so much information is that it's just a huge file. When you look at a standard JPEG file, it can be around 5.5 megabytes. Whereas its RAW counterpart is going to be around 25 megabytes. And that's really something you should factor in when you're taking a huge amount of photos or photographing some kind of event. And that brings us to JPEGs. JPEGs, as I mentioned earlier, are a much smaller file when you compare them to their RAW counterparts. And another advantage with JPEGs is that when you hit the shutter release on your camera already applies some small basic edits such as blurring, sharpening, and adjusting some of the colors depending on your camera model. And that can be one of the advantages as it's pretty much ready to go when you're finished taking the photograph. Having the file ready to go and being such a small file size sounds like an advantage, but it's not if you want to perform any kind of more advanced edit. And if you really messed a photograph up, then it'll be almost impossible to bring back from the brink as you could with a RAW file. And that's not to say that you can't edit and manipulate a JPEG file, but it'll be nearly impossible to edit as intensively as you could with its RAW counterpart. So, in summary, JPEGs are a small file, but they still capture a relatively good amount of image information, and they're ready to go right after you hit the shutter release on your camera. And that correlates into being able to use them almost immediately on different phones, tablets, and devices, as well as applications, as JPEG is a very widely used format. The downside to JPEGs is that every time you open and edit them, they suffer from image degradation or loss. And lastly, the big disadvantage with JPEGs is that because they don't contain so much information, we can't heavily manipulate them or really edit them as we could with their RAW counterparts. So now that we've got the theory covered, and believe me, theory can be boring, let's take a look at how this looks like in practice in Zonar Photo Studio. Okay, so I've already got my manager open here and two photographs. It's the same photograph, just one is a JPEG and one is a RAW version. And let's start things off with the RAW. And don't worry, even though it's a .arw, this is a RAW file. You might come across different file names such as .nef, .dng, or even .raw. And like this one, .arw. It's all a RAW file, don't worry about it. Just different camera manufacturers have different names and different ways of displaying it. So I'm gonna move to develop. And the photographer in this photo may have just wanted to put the focus on the sun and the ocean here in the background, and the model is just more of like a silhouette figure. But I'd like to show you, because we have so much information and data within this RAW format, how much you can pull out of the photograph. So I'm gonna move here to exposure, and I'm just slightly gonna increase that. And I'm gonna focus here on contrast. I'm gonna really tone that down. You can already see how much of the model we can now see. I'm going to slightly increase the lights. And I'm going to push the shadows here much farther to the right. Now, this isn't necessarily how I want the image to finally look, but I just want to show you, because of all the information we have in the RAW file, you can really manipulate it to an extent just like this. So let's try and do the same thing with the JPEG file. So I'm going to increase exposure slightly. crank on that contrast. And as you can see, we're just not getting the same effect, and we're getting a lot of different artifacts and strange looking things within the photograph. I'm gonna increase the lights a bit, and then same thing with the shadows. I'm gonna boost it up, and you can see what happens. It's just not as clear, and we don't have all the data to be able to manipulate and pull from different parts of the photograph as we could with its raw counterpart. Now I'd like to just compare them side by side. And you can clearly see why, when it comes to editing and playing around and manipulating with an image, raw files really have the upper hand here. So, can we say one's better than the other? Are RAWs better than JPEGs, or are JPEGs better than RAWs? Well, that's hard to say. It just really depends on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. If you're interested in taking a quick snapshot, etc., and you don't want to play around with the photo much, JPEGs are the path for you. If you want to edit and manipulate a photograph, then RAW files are the way to go. But with today's technology, you don't have to choose. Most cameras allow you the possibility of shooting in both RAW and JPEG at the same time, so that comes in super handy. Just remember that if you're photographing in RAW, or even the combination of RAW plus JPEG, it's going to take up a huge amount of your card, so just keep that in mind. I hope this was informative for you. I hope you liked the video. Give us a thumbs up, and I hope to catch you next time in the next video. And until then, have a good one.